Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by our guest, Noah Hoffman. Listeners, Noah is a two-time Olympian. He competed for Team USA in Nordic skiing before moving on to become an advocate for athletes, both in a personal capacity and as a board member of the group Global Athlete, as well as an athlete presenter for the education team at USADA. Now, Noah is joining us today to talk about how doping affects athletes and how it shaped him into the advocate he is today. So, Noah, we're thrilled to welcome you to the show today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And of course, I'm well aware of PCC's work and really happy to be on the show.
Well, we are delighted to welcome you here and excited to hear your stories. So I guess maybe to start off with, to give our listeners a little bit of context, can you tell us a little bit more about your sport, Nordic skiing, for anyone out there who might not be as familiar with it?
Absolutely. So Nordic skiing, or I refer to it often as cross-country skiing, and Nordic skiing is kind of an umbrella term that actually at the Olympic level encompasses ski jumping, as well as the combined discipline of Nordic combined, which is ski jumping paired with cross-country skiing. But I was just a cross-country skier, definitely did not do any ski jumping. That terrifies me. And then cross-country skiing itself has two different styles. There's skate and classical style. Classical style is where your feet are parallel in a track, and skate is more like ice skating on snow. But in general, you're skiing up hills as well as down them. There's no chairlifts involved in cross-country skiing. And what I love about cross-country skiing is that it's really a lifelong sport. You can do it kind of forever and at all different speeds. And people who have never been on skis before can find that they can go out on cross-country skis and they can move around, and you can start kind of by just walking on skis, especially in the classical style. So it really is a very accessible sport. One other thing to mention is that there are many different distances in competitive cross-country skiing. At the Olympic level, there are 6 medal events in cross-country, and there are 2 sprint events, which I definitely did not do. I'm not a sprinter, don't have that fast twitch muscle in my body. So I was focused on the longer distance events, but the sprint events are about 1.5 kilometers, about a mile in length, and they take athletes only about 3 minutes, so very fast. And then the distance events at the Olympics range from 10 kilometers in the distance relay all the way up to 50 kilometers. And those were my specialties, especially the really long ones like the 50K, which is 31 miles. So it's a great sport, tends to be low injury rate, not like alpine skiing where you're going 70 or 80 miles an hour. But the issues that cross-country skiers have more to do with overuse injuries because it's very repetitive.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And I'm curious, you mentioned it's an accessible sport, of course. It sounds like a lot of fun, but how did you get interested in this area?
So I grew up in Colorado, in Aspen, so in a very famous ski town where most people are alpine skiers. And I, of course, alpine ski and ski on the mountain and love that as well. But there's also an incredible network of cross-country ski trails in the Aspen area. They're actually all maintained by the city and free, which is kind of remarkable. And I found pretty early on, my parents were both recreational runners, and they introduced me to running and to endurance sports. And I found early on that I loved the endurance aspect, had a knack for it. And what I particularly liked was that it was very clear how you get faster at cross-country skiing. And that is you just train a lot and do it a lot. You don't have to overcome your fear. You don't have to learn a specific skill that your body struggles to do or increase your flexibility or train a very specific muscle. You really just have to get fitter. So I found that my willingness to train hard and my motivation to do long aerobic workouts, so things like 100-mile road bike rides and 30-mile runs, that those had a direct return on their investment. So that was what really attracted me, was the ability to know how to pursue excellence, how to succeed.
Oh, that's quite impressive. I'm not sure I would make it through a 30-mile run myself, but that is phenomenal. And of course, we mentioned some of your accomplishments there, a 2-time Olympian. But then how did you, or what made you decide to kind of transition from being an athlete to then becoming a voice for athletes and really advocating in this anti-doping space?
So I didn't end my career in order to be an athlete advocate. In fact, when I ended my career, I was a little bit disillusioned, I should say, with elite sport. And I really thought I was going to just walk away and have a clean break. So to start with, the reason I ended my career when I did, honestly, was because my results had plateaued. I really was consistently improving. I was on the upswing all the way up through the 2014 Olympics. I was 24 years old at that point. I'd been on the international circuit for 5 or 6 years at that time and had gotten faster and faster, had some of the best races of my career in Sochi. And then after the Sochi Games, I had a series of setbacks. And the very first World Cup race of the following season, I fell and broke my leg, broke my fibula, and tore some muscles in my ankle and had to get surgery. I recovered from that and then had some overtraining issues, and I had some issues with my posture. Actually, I kind of developed a huge curve in my back that prevented me from skiing in the way that I needed to be successful. And then kind of addressed those issues and really wanted to get back to the very top level of the sport, and embarked on a huge training increase that I knew was a really big risk. And I don't regret making that decision, but it did not work out for me. And I ended up overtrained and sick and injured all season. And I actually almost walked away from the sport the year before Pyeongchang. And I'm so glad that I went back, and I didn't have a great start to the year and kind of did just enough to squeak onto the Olympic team for my second Olympics. But I knew at that point that I was going to be done. And I actually started applying for university, for college, because I had postponed my education. At this point, it had been 11 years since high school. And I actually submitted those college applications before leaving for Pyeongchang, and then went over there. And I was not skiing as well as I was in Sochi. I was not as focused on my results, but I got to be over there for Jesse and Keegan, my teammates, winning the first gold medal ever for U.S. cross-country skiing. And they're like sisters to me. I had watched them grow and develop and race as athletes, and I lived on the road with them. And I spent Jesse's first Christmas away from home with her. And I always tell that story when people talk about her gold medal. I'd say, I can tell you about the time that she was a really young athlete and trying to deal with being gone from home over the holidays for the first time. And I was like, okay, I'll get Jessie a Christmas tree. I'm not really a big Christmas person, but I know she wants a tree. And I went and got her a tree and brought it back while she was out on a training session with Liz, my other teammate who was also with us for this holiday. Jessie and Liz were out skiing, and I got this tree. I set it up, and Jessie got back and she burst into tears because she said the single thing that my family always did during Christmas was go pick out the tree together. And she was so disappointed not to pick out the tree. So to have these types of relationships with my teammates, and then to watch them have this incredible moment of winning gold in the team event. And then Jessie just won the first individual medal ever for U.S. country skiing last week, or earlier this week, I should say, in Beijing. It's really incredible. So being there at those Olympics and watching my teammates' success was really one of the highlights of my career. And then I got to retire to kind of script my ending. I went to 2 more World Cup events after those Olympics and finish in front of 100,000 people watching the 50K in Norway at Holmenkollen, and really go out of the sport the way that not that many athletes get to, which is on my own terms. So that's the first half of that answer. And then I guess there's the question of how I got into advocacy. It was really fortuitous. So a mogul skier who's a good friend of mine, an Olympic mogul skier named Heather McPhee, Heather Watanabe now, she was very involved in athlete advocacy, and she'd been asked to join this brand new organization that was forming called Global Athlete to focus on international issues. And Heather was just starting a family and was already committed in the sports world and was becoming a financial advisor and just didn't have the space in her schedule. So she knew that I was really interested in issues of human rights and the broad issues of accountability in governance, the issues that are really paramount at the international level of sport, but maybe less so when you're an athlete advocate at the domestic level. So she thought it would be a really good fit for me, and she suggested that I get involved. And the organization was founded by somebody named Rob Keeler, who's still the executive director. And Rob had just resigned from WADA in kind of protest of the way that WADA had handled the state-sponsored doping in Sochi, and really believed that there needed to be accountability from athletes at the international level, which was why he stepped down just to found this organization. And I had seen firsthand the state-sponsored doping in Sochi and had a lot of experience on the other side of competing against athletes who were doping. And so it was a really good fit. And the other athletes that have been involved in Global Athletes, like Olympic champion cyclist from Britain, Callum Skinner, and sliding athlete Bree Shaw, just a great pool of athletes that have been instrumental in the success that Global Athlete has had in lobbying for changes in international sport.
Oh, absolutely. And I'd love to get into some of the details of your own experiences as we kind of go through this conversation today. But maybe let's start just with your role there with Global Athlete. So can you talk a little bit more about what that experience has been like for you?
Yeah, so Global Athlete never claimed to be a representative body of Olympic athletes. We would love if there were an independent representative body of Olympic athletes, but it's a monumental task to form such an organization across 206 national Olympic committees and 40 different Olympic sports. It's just an incredibly diverse population of people to organize. And you think about the barriers to forming a union, even just within a single sector of employment in the US. And then you think about trying to do that across people who are basically doing many different jobs and from all over the world. And it's virtually impossible. So we like to say that we represent any athlete who comes to us for support. That's kind of the position we've taken, is that we want to be a voice for the athletes that need representation and athletes that are struggling to stand up for their rights against sport administrators. And we are working with other international and domestic, actually, independent athlete groups to support them to help new athlete groups come to being. So, for instance, the Athletics Association is a new independent athlete group in track and field. And we really played a key role in helping them get off the ground. Same with the International Swimmers Alliance, which is doing the same thing in the sport of aquatics. We're trying to just be an independent voice for any athlete that is looking for that voice and that support. And we're trying to make sure we're supporting athletes when their rights are being violated or the international sport system is failing them. For instance, we're standing by and ready, working with a group of attorneys who are willing and able to do pro bono work for any athlete whose rights are violated if they stand up and make political statements at the Olympic Games. So we're trying to kind of add value where we can and grow this movement to hold sport administrators accountable.
That's really cool. And I think your passion for this area really comes through as you describe some of the work that you're doing. And hearing you talk and looking at some of the statements that you've put out there already, one of the interesting distinctions I think that you make is that you don't really like to call doping cheating, which a lot of people do call it cheating, but you instead call it fraud. So can you maybe walk us through your rationale of why you like to make that distinction?
The word cheating to me has always been something I associate with a board game,
right?
or some sort of low stakes endeavor. And it doesn't fully encapsulate what is happening at the international level when athletes are professionals who are doing this work for their job and as a career. And there's lots and lots of money on the line, hundreds of thousands of dollars each race that a doped athlete is competing in. They're really defrauding the other athletes that they're starting against. And it's no different than any other type of fraud that we see where people are getting financial gain at the expense of others. And in particular, that's true, I think, when you start talking about state-sponsored doping and the way that we see states, nations using doping for geopolitical ends. We view sport as this wholesome, apolitical endeavor, and we often say that our athletes should stick to sports and that sports should be the one place we can get a break from politics. But of course, that's just naive, and it's not in reality the way sport is used internationally, and it allows malicious actors to use sport to their own political ends when we don't recognize that it is being used in that way, and that we perpetuate this falsity that sport is separate from all the other divisions that exists in society.
Certainly. And as you've alluded to during our conversation, you've had personal experiences with this. You know, you've told the story previously about nearly missing out on a win of a World Cup stage victory because of doping fraud. So I'd love to, if you're willing to share the story with our listeners today, get into some of the details of what happened there.
Absolutely. So this was at the Tour de Ski, actually right before the Sochi 2014 Olympics. So the Tour de Ski is the hardest event on the World Cup Tour. It's modeled after the Tour de France. It's 7 races in 9 days across 3 different countries, and it incorporates every different type of skiing, skate and classic and sprint and distance. And the queen stage of the Tour de Ski is this point-to-point race, at least it was in 2014, this point-to-point race from Cortina, Italy to Toblach, Italy. It's a distance of 35 kilometers. And it was really built for me because the first 17 kilometers are all uphill. You basically ski up to the top of this pass and then down the other side. And I loved hilly courses and I loved climbing. And that was my specialty, was going uphill. My aerobic capacity was where I excelled. And I had the race of my life this day. It was the type of day that every athlete dreams of, where I couldn't make myself hurt. I could just go as hard as possible and I couldn't feel any pain. It just felt so good and so easy. And also, I was a little bit lucky in that there had been a couple of sprint races in the first couple stages of the tour. And as I mentioned, I was not a very good sprinter. And this was what's called the pursuit start race, where you start in order of your standings in the overall tour and the amount of time that you're back. So the leader of the tour starts first. And if the second place person is 12 seconds in the overall standings behind the leader, the second place person starts 12 seconds later. And that continues until every athlete has started. And I was way behind the leaders. I was maybe 4.5 minutes behind the leader of the race. But there's also awards given for the fastest time on the day, not just the first person to start to cross the finish line. And because of where my start position was, it means I had lots and lots of athletes kind of strung out in front of me who I could catch. And I just went off, and like I said, I felt like Superman, and I just picked them off one at a time. I'd ski up to the back of them, catch my breath for a moment, and then go around them and go catch somebody else. And I did this all the way up the climb, 17 kilometers. I just felt amazing. And when I was about a kilometer from the top of the climb, I saw this huge group of skiers that had clustered together. You know, there's an advantage, like in all racing sports, there's an advantage to drafting. And there was this group of skiers that had clustered together. And I knew that if I didn't catch that group of skiers by the top of the climb, because they had so many people together, that the draft that they had together was going to mean that they were going to put all the time that I'd gained on them, they were going to put that back into me on the downside of that climb, all the way back down to toe block. So I put my head down, and right as we were cresting the top of the hill, I latched on to the back of this group. And
wow.
There were athletes that had started almost 2.5 minutes ahead of me in this group that I had caught. And I got into this draft and just sucked in, and I stayed there all the way down to toe block. And not only did I feel amazing, I also had this just kind of perfect setup where you can't ask for a better setup to be able to just like go catch people all the way up the climb and then get a perfect draft going down the backside. And when I crossed the finish line, I said, no way did anybody ski faster than me today.
Mm-hmm.
I just couldn't have gone any better. I can't see how I could have gone any faster. And in the Tour de Ski, I had a couple more races to go. I didn't go look at results. I went and started preparing for the next day and did my cool down and then showered. We had a couple-hour drive over to Val di Fiemme, Italy. And I got in the van to head to Val di Fiemme and looked at the results. And this athlete from Austria, Johannes Dwyer, had not only skied faster than me that day, but he had skied almost a minute faster than me. And he had been in the top 5 rankings of the Tour de Ski starting. And so he had done this skiing almost entirely alone. He hadn't had the athletes to catch, and he hadn't had the draft on the downhill. And I was just flabbergasted. How did he do that? And I was extremely impressed, and also like, I'll just never be that good. That was what I thought. I was like, this is as good as I can be. And I was second in the result sheet. So fast forward about 6 weeks, we were in Sochi most of the way through the Olympics. It was a couple days before the 50K, the final race. And I was actually having breakfast, and I saw an open table, and I saw Johannes sitting there, and I went and joined him, and I sat down for breakfast with him, and we were chatting about his brand new newborn son, whose name actually is Noah. He was very excited to tell me that.
Aww.
And he was also preparing for the 50K. That was going to be the best race for both of us that we were both focused on. And we had a wonderful conversation with him, went out and did my training session that day, getting ready for the race, came back to my room from the training session in the Olympic Village. And I open up my phone, and there's a headline that says Austria's Johannes Dwyer kicked out of the Olympics for testing positive for EPO.
Oh, wow.
And my heart just sank. I was like, what? I had breakfast with him this morning. How did that happen?
Right.
And he came out a couple of days later, and he admitted having used EPO since the previous summer. It's about June, he said. And the test result that he had tested positive, the test was taken right around the Tour de Ski, maybe even that same day as the point-to-point race in which I had been second to him. And his results were nullified from that Tour de Ski, but it's not the same learning that you won a stage of the Tour de Ski 6 or 8 weeks later as it is learning it on the moment. And I have such mixed feelings. One of the things Johannes said when in the press conferences that followed his positive test, I have not spoken or seen to him since this day, but just following him in the press, he said that the pressure he felt to provide for his new family, for this young son named Noah that he has, was one of his motivations for doping. I know that he's a human being and he made a really bad decision, and that still pains me to think about that. because I really can hold these two truths about him. The friend of mine who had a wonderful chat and was so excited about his new family at the Olympic Village, and the other one who defrauded me, who stole this World Cup stage win from me.
Oh, definitely. And I'm really glad that you brought up this point of just the pressures that athletes, including yourself, I'm sure at times had faced throughout their careers. And I think that is something that is a challenge and something that I think the community as a whole still needs to find a good solution for in terms of deterring doping in some of these really high pressure, high stress situations. And of course, in this case, you were eventually awarded the victory. But as you alluded to, it's not the same. There's already damage done from that doping fraud. So can you maybe go into a little bit more detail about how this personally had an effect on you?
Yeah. So for instance, Johannes's positive test came before the end of the season. So the points were recalculated. So I didn't lose out on any season-long points from Johannes's actions. But this is the same season, remember, that the Russian state-sponsored doping system was going on. And I had been, of course, racing against Russians all year long. And at the end of the year, and this is after the Olympic year, the 2013-14 season, I finished 31st on the world ranking list. And the top 30 athletes on that list qualify for the U.S. ski team's A team. And anybody not in the top 30 is not on the A team and relative to the B team. And the A team receives about $25,000 in funding more than the B team. So B team athletes have to fundraise to provide their own lodging and food and flights, all travel expenses for all of their expenses year round. So that includes summer training camps and winter World Cup season. 125 Swiss francs a day is how much it costs to be on the World Cup in the winter. And we're on the road for 125 days plus or minus. You can do that math. It adds up to a lot of money. So I missed out on this funding by not only one place, but also fewer than 10 World Cup points. And World Cup points are awarded all season long based on results. And that's the difference between a single 10th place finish and an 8th place finish is 10 points. So depending on where you are on the result sheet, it could be as much as 1 or 2 places higher. And I would have had those 10 extra points that I needed. And a year and a half, 2 years later, the Russian state-sponsored doping scheme comes out. And I realized that the 4 or 5 Russians ahead of me on that list had all been part of this doping program. And they cost me this spot on the A team. And I never did qualify for the US ski team A team. That's as close as I ever came, was this 31st place finish that season, the best of my career, the 2013-14 year. And I had to do all that fundraising and had to make choices about my athletic career with money in mind. Could I afford to go to this training camp and do this travel and this racing? And I was so lucky to have incredible sponsors and private donors who did fund my career and enabled me to really pursue excellence. And for the most part, I was lucky to be able to just make decisions based on what I thought was best for my skiing and not worry too much about the finances. But still, there is a really big difference between having to do all that fundraising and having to ask people for money and just knowing that the team is going to be providing it. So that's just one small way of kind of the downstream trickle effects of doping is the Russian state-sponsored doping program. I didn't win any medals. I wasn't 4th, 5th, or 6th in any Olympic event. My best race was 24th after actually a couple of athletes had been disqualified. So I think I finished the day in 26th. So I didn't miss out on any medals, but I did miss out on this $25,000 in funding. And every athlete on the result sheet is hurt by doping. And that's not just the ones you see who aren't on the podium.
Definitely. And I think this is such an important point to drive home because I think the ones that typically catch the headlines are kind of these podium shifts that people say, oh, this person was doping, so now this person gets bumped up and they didn't get to participate in the ceremony. But I think many people don't realize that there are these other downstream effects that are affecting way more athletes than just the people who missed their big opportunity on the podium. So you touched on it a little bit, but what do you think this meant for your career? Did this obviously change how you could train and what you had to do in terms of allocating time for funding? But in terms of, I guess, the overall trajectory of your career, do you think it would have been different if you made that A team?
It's so hard to say, right? Because there's so many variables. Like I said, that next season in the very first World Cup event, I broke my leg and missed a couple of months and had to rehab from that and then had the posture issues and I had the overtraining. And it's really hard to say how or if things would have been different if I had made that A team. But it matters at a deeper level than that, which is that my motivation for pursuing endurance sport in general was because I wanted to be the best in the world and I wanted to see what my body could do. And ironically, one of the people that I was so inspired by as a young person was Lance Armstrong. I would sit and watch the Tour de France in 2001, 2002, 2003, and then I would go out and go on a 120-mile road bike ride by myself because I wanted to be just like Lance Armstrong. I wanted to be an endurance sports athlete just like Lance. And so I had already had my heart broken once and had kind of this idealism of sport crushed for me once. And when it came out that Lance was a fraud all the way through his career, I almost walked away from the sport because I was so frustrated and I really questioned what I was doing out there. And then when it came out that the international system was again failing to stop the tide of institutional doping, when the Russian scandal broke and that my competitors were doping, it really made me question what the point of it all was. If we're just these figures in this geopolitical battle for power and this thing that's way bigger than us, this battle of nations and ideologies, then why am I doing this? And why my little pursuit of excellence and pursuit of wanting to be the best in the world and see what I could accomplish? Like, what did any of that mean? And I have much more clarity about that now that I've stepped away from the sport. And I would love to talk about what the value I do see in sport is. But that's my answer for kind of how this was so impactful. It was really beyond any monetary or even any results for me. It was really about questioning the entire value of sport.
Definitely. And maybe that is a perfect segue then. So maybe share with us now, if you're willing to, what did you see the value of sport? And particularly, why is clean sport so important?
I'm going to bring this back to my teammates and getting to be there in Pyeongchang to watch Keegan and Jesse win gold and watching my other teammates who have just persevered in the face of really challenging conditions. For instance, Rosie Brennan, who was fourth right behind Jesse in the sprint the other day. She has had just so many setbacks for her career. She was on the U.S. ski team and then cut from the U.S. ski team for many, many years before she requalified and is now one of the best athletes in the world. And the value that I see in sport is really embodied by Rosie and by Jesse and by Keegan. And that is as really incredible leaders and role models on every issue that plagues society. So, for instance, we see a ton of Winter Olympic athletes being huge advocates for climate policy because as a Winter Olympic athlete, not only are we dependent on snow and on winter conditions to be able to do our jobs, but we also see changes in the climate, I think, more acutely than many other people because we're traveling all over the globe to the same venues over and over again. And we see the way that snow that used to be so reliable at these venues no longer is falling and the temperatures are not right. And more venues, almost every venue these days is relying on snowmaking, which of course has its own environmental impact. And we're very aware that our own travel around the world is impacting and contributing to the climate crisis. And I think that athletes are in a really unique position, winter sport athletes in particular, to be able to be leaders in climate policy and in advocating for sustainable policies that includes how we can continue to have a global interconnected planet while having a sustainable climate policy. So that's one way. And two other things I want to highlight. One is that Jessie in particular has been very outspoken about the eating disorders that she experienced as a young person when she was an up-and-coming athlete and that she had to battle through and that were really acute and incredibly difficult. And she has been such a leader for young women who are experiencing these same issues and body image issues and the ability to be proud of your own body and to be healthy. Jessie has been just such a vocal leader who has this personal experience and who has come out and shared her story. And then the last one I want to mention is Keegan, Jessie's teammate in that gold medal event in Pyeongchang. Keegan was diagnosed with breast cancer less than 3 months after those Olympics concluded. She retired from skiing. It was her 5th Olympic Games. She won gold and then retired. And less than 3 months later, she's diagnosed with breast cancer. How can somebody you think so healthy and so fit be so vulnerable? And Keegan was so strong and so public about her battle that she has become such a leader in the survivor community and just a beacon of hope for other people who are undergoing cancer treatment, who are experiencing the pain and fear that comes with a cancer diagnosis. So those types of athletes being leaders in society on just an incredibly diverse set of issues, that's why I believe in the power of sport. And it only happens, right, if it's clean sport, if you can actually be inspired by what you see, if you don't think that it's just who has the best scientists and who's got the most money or who's been able to buy off the anti-doping officials. That type of ability to be leaders and to inspire people depends on sport being clean.
Definitely. And I think you hit the nail on the head there, just that so many people in the public, particularly young athletes, are looking up to these elite athletes. And I think it's so important that they portray these important societal messages, but also convey the value of sport and why sport needs to be clean. So I'm so glad you're having this conversation with us today. And I know you've also advocated for the Rodchenkov Anti-Doping Act. And I think this is an important piece of legislation. So how do you think this act would help global anti-doping efforts?
The Rodchenkov Act, and I'm so proud of the whole team that was kind of involved in pushing this thing through. I mean, it passed unanimously in both chambers of Congress. I mean, how often do you hear of anything being unanimous these days? It's just absolutely remarkable.
Right.
The reason why it's so important is because the type of doping that is plaguing sport these days is not individual athletes doping. We do see that a little bit, as evidenced by Johannes Dwyer of Austria, who was acting alone when he took EPO and beat me in that stage of the Tour de Ski. But for the most part, the big issue in doping is this institutional state-sponsored doping. And the global anti-doping system that is set up primarily with WADA and the Court of Arbitration for Sport connected to the IOC, those institutions are not set up for and cannot handle state-sponsored doping at this level. They are set up to catch and to punish individual athletes for doping. But that is not what we see. I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Gregory Rodchenkov on the Global Athlete podcast over the summer. And Dr. Rodchenkov, I asked him directly, I said, when you were instigating this doping fraud, did athletes have the opportunity not to dope? Could they say no? And he said that the only way they could say no, it was just this theoretical. I think he said only theoretically can they say no. The reality is that if they want to continue their careers, if they want to be on the teams, if they want to have the results, they had no choice but to say yes. And so it's not the athletes that are making this decision. It is sport administrators and coming from the highest levels of government in Russia. And unfortunately, there has been no adequate answer from global anti-doping regulators. And that's because they're not set up to deal with this. And so the answer to state-sponsored doping has to be state action. And the only way that you can have state action is if you have a law in other countries that also perpetrate institutional doping schemes illegal. So this means that instigating a system-wide doping scheme like we saw in Russia is now illegal for the people who are actually responsible for this system, the people who are actually instigating it, the people who are administering it, and not for the people who are victims of this scheme, which includes the athletes who they themselves are being doped. So that's why I think the Rodchenkov Act strikes the perfect balance of making the facilitation of doping illegal, but not making it illegal for athletes. The current anti-doping system is well structured to be able to catch and punish athletes who choose to dope. But the Rodchenkov Act is filling this gap in really putting the responsibility on the people who are instigating the big system-wide state-sponsored schemes.
Certainly. And I think, Noah, throughout our conversation, we've really hammered home some of these important points specifically about how global athletics are. And I think this global nature really makes it quite complicated, but makes it wonderful in a lot of ways. So when you think about anti-doping around the world and maybe just kind of big picture there for you, what are some of the changes that you've seen since you've been competing?
I think that the Rodchenkov Act has to be kind of top of list, where we are seeing other countries take seriously this idea that doping is not a sport problem alone. And we saw this also at the 2019 World Championships in Seefeld, Austria for cross-country skiing, for the Nordic World Championships. This was the year after I retired, but there was this big doping scandal that broke in Seefeld, and it was related to this single German doctor who was doping all these athletes. And there was not just skiers involved, there were cyclists involved. And the way that this system was exposed was through state action. Again, it was Austrian and German authorities who did the investigative work and who uncovered this scheme, and then ultimately were involved in the raid and were involved in punishing these athletes, because in Austria, where the championships are being held, doping is illegal actually for athletes as well. And generally the punishments are minimal. But what's important is that the authorities have the ability to be involved in this system and to investigate and to do things that the anti-doping regulators cannot. And so we're really seeing governments take doping seriously. I think that's the single biggest and most positive change that we've seen in the last several years. And there's so much more that needs to be done. And part of that is we have to see the global anti-doping system become independent from sport administrators. There is just too much of a conflict of interest where these doping revelations, like the state-sponsored doping in Russia, it hurts the brand and it hurts the value of the Olympic movement. And so we need independence of these global anti-doping regulators from the sport movement. That's the next step. And we've been pushing for that as athlete advocates and will continue to do so. So we've seen a lot of change, but there's so much more to be done.
Definitely. And I think a lot of challenges and limitations remain in anti-doping that the whole community is working to try to resolve piece by piece, one thing at a time. But if you had all of the resources and didn't face a lot of the barriers that hold everybody back, Noah, for you, what is the one problem in anti-doping that you would want to solve most?
I'm going to come back to the independence. If I had all the resources, I would say, okay, IOC, we don't need your money anymore to fund anti-doping. We have the resources to do so, whether that comes from governments around the world or from some sort of a trust that can be established where there's an independent pool of money. But I would say that sport regulators are going to be a completely independent entity from sport administration. There's going to be no link between the two. They're going to have the ability to hand down punishment and to hold administrators accountable just as they hold athletes accountable. And we're going to instigate a regulatory system that actually has the ability to hold institutions accountable in the way that we have seen their ability to hold athletes accountable.
Very interesting. It sounds like you've got the plan all hatched out here.
Just need enough resources to cover WADA's budget. That's all I'm asking for. So no small ask.
Well, Noah, you can tell you put a lot of thought into this, and you can tell again that you are so passionate about this area in anti-doping, and we appreciate you sharing your stories and your perspectives. But if you've piqued the interest of our listeners out there and they want to learn more about you and more about what you're doing, what's the best way for them to do so?
So the first thing is to follow Global Athlete. And there's a button on Global Athlete's website, which is at globalathlete.org, that says join the movement. And this is just showing support for what we're doing. You'll get on our mailing list and you'll see anytime there's a big issue in international sport, we're releasing statements kind of from an independent athlete perspective. So that's the first, is go to globalathlete.org and join the movement. If you want to follow me personally, I have a brand new Twitter account. Actually, I resisted Twitter for so long, but I've kind of gotten on the bandwagon now with this advocacy work. It's become an essential platform for me to use. So I am at Hoffnoaman, HOFFNOAHMAN, Hoffnoaman at Twitter. So follow me on my new account and support the work that we're doing, support independent organizations to hold sport administrators accountable.
Excellent. Well, listeners, definitely get connected with Noah on Twitter. Check out the Global Athlete website. And Noah, it's been such a pleasure to chat with you today. We really appreciate you spending time with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a joy.
Well, we've enjoyed our time today. Listeners, it's been wonderful to have you here as well. If you haven't had a chance yet, we would truly appreciate it if you could take a moment to leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform to share your experience with the show. And we hope you'll join us for our next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.